delight to be here. He did tell you a little bit about our experiences this morning. This is our second stop, but we actually approached the airports 4 times. I'm so glad to see so many out on a nice cold winter day. But I was told that one of the issues that we're to address is that of family values and the importance of the family. That's not too difficult for me to talk about the importance of the family, seeing that I have a rather large family. My wife and I have 5 children. We have 18 grandchildren and 14 great-great-grandchildren. And I've been married for 52 years. So marriage and family is obviously a very important issue for us. You know, there was something that happened early in my campaigns in Texas, is that my wife came up with this idea. She said, you know what we ought to do is send out a cookbook, because the opposition, can you imagine the opposition attacking another person running for Congress? Well, they were attacking me and made me sound like a terrible person. And she says, what we need to do is send out a family cookbook, put the recipes in from all the kids, and take pictures of the family. And I told her, why in the world would you want to do that? I said, they don't want to see pictures of the family. They want to hear me give speeches about the Federal Reserve System. And she said, oh no, she says, they're beating you up badly, and some people would like to know that you have a family. So I said, all right, go ahead. And I usually tell this at Republican functions about how I was so opposed to it. But then I always had to admit, you know what, it was probably the best political literature we ever sent out, because the people really enjoyed that. People do want to know what you're all about and your family. I got interested slightly out of college in medical school in reading free market economics. That was back in the 1970s. I finished my OB/GYN residency in 1968. After having served in the military for 5 years, I was drafted and served in the Air Force as a flight surgeon. And I was drafted during the Cuban crisis. But in '68, my wife and I, we were raised in Pittsburgh. We went back to Texas because I was stationed there, set up a medical practice. Practiced OB/GYN for many, many years, delivered 4,000 babies over the years. And we have 3 of our kids that are in medicine, one daughter is in OB/GYN as well. And you may have heard that I did have another son. He decided to do something in politics. And I can't remember, I think he's a senator from Kentucky or someplace like that. So that's been pretty nice and exciting for all of us. But when thinking about politics and thinking about the importance of family, I think about the story in the Old Testament. I think it's very important to help me understand the importance of family. And that has to do with Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 8. It tells a story about when the Israelites came to Samuel and said, we want a king. We need a king. We need a king to take care of us. And Samuel argued, but wholeheartedly said, no, that is not what we're doing. Now, the one thing interesting I find about this is that it's sort of ironic or just a coincidence. But you know, it's Samuel 1, chapter 8. I keep thinking, Article 1, section 8. And anybody who knows the Constitution, Article 1, section 8 is a really good part of the Constitution, which strictly limits the Congress to doing about 20 things, and the rest is what we're supposed to do. But when the people and the elders came to Samuel and said, what we need is a king. And Samuel considered this an affront to the belief that they already had a king. God was their king. When they left, when Moses took the Israelites out of Egypt, they got rid of the Pharaoh and God became their king. But they always argued, and there was always a movement to have idols and others. But then they had a period of time where the judges were the leader of the state. But the country Israel was made up of families. It was a patriarchal society, and they didn't have a king. But Samuel warned them from God's message, don't do it. And he lists all these things. It's really interesting to read it. I have the quote here, but I won't read it because it's rather long. It said, don't get a king. You know what the king's going to do? The king's going to tax you and regulate you. He will conscript your children, send them off to wars, And they go on, and he said, this is what they'll do to your daughters, and they'll take so much of your land, they'll take so much of your seed corn, and the whole works. And you know, it's so appropriate for what today. And Samuel argued the case that this was not the fact that they just wanted a king, but it was an affront to the fact that they were substituting a king for God. And just think in our history, in our lifetime now, I mean, wasn't communism a God? Communism was God. Communist, the leaders dictated what truth was. And they would write down, this is the truth. And that was it. Think of the people who become deities. I mean, in Korea, we still have them. In Japan, they have them. But over this last 100 years, so there's plenty of governments where the leader becomes a deity. So the concern was very justified that they were substituting, you know, an idol for God. And today, why should that be appropriate today? Because I think in some ways, this is what we're doing. We're rejecting the notion of family, and we're accepting a king. Oh no, we don't have a king. We have an elected president, and you know, democracy is just perfect. And democracy sorts everything out. The majority rules, and on and on. But the fact is that there's a lot of dictates, and the many things that Samuel was concerned about, we have today: over-taxation, over-regulation, conscription, and fighting wars. And even in that passage, they talk about how they fought wars, because the Israelites had to fight a lot of wars. And if they didn't have a strong central government, and they didn't have conscription, how did they fight those wars? And the Old Testament is, you know, very, very clear that when they were living within God's rule, they would win these battles. But the way they fought the rules was the individuals, the family members, the clans and the tribes, they would always send a certain amount of people. The young men went, the women didn't go, and they would send. It reminded me of the way they talked about in this country, having a militia. And the militia, we weren't supposed to have a standing army. The federal government was against the standing army. And the Israelites did not have a standing army. But they fought their wars, and they won their wars unless they strayed. So today, we are living in an age where I think the family has been greatly diminished. I think there's a failure today to recognize that our rights and our lives come from our Creator. We have drifted into accepting the notion that government provides for us, and government will take care of us. And just as the Israelites were not satisfied with their kings, and the predictions and the warnings of Samuel came true, because he said it would cost a lot. The cost would be exorbitant, and that you would not get what you were asking for. And today, we're dependent on the king. We're dependent on the central government. They're to take care of us from cradle to grave. They're supposed to take care of our educational needs, our medical needs, the whole work. And yet, it works. But wow, hasn't it? Years after years. And the worse things got, the more they debased the currency, the more dishonesty, the more counterfeiting we've had. And we've had ultra counterfeiting of our currency since 1971, since the gold standard just disappeared. And in doing that, we had been taught, because we've had a benevolent king that said, we will take care of you. And they have printed the money, and we have taken care of people, whoever has a need. People have need. And you'd think that food stamps were started for a few people who were indigent and needed some help. And today you have millions and millions of people with the recession going on food stamps. But what is happening, our dependency on our king, the dependency on our state, is coming to an end, because we're at a point now where we no longer can afford it. We have taxed as much as we can. We have borrowed as much as we can. We are now resorting to inflating as much as we can. That's what all this QE2 stuff is talking about. This past week, it was unbelievable how much the Federal Reserve created. Like in 1 week, they can create $30 billion just out of thin air to keep this going. We have given up our responsibility to care for ourselves and our family and delivered it over to the government and into a secret government called the Federal Reserve System. Federal Reserve actually can spend in 1 year more money than we do in the Congress. No appropriation, no authorization, and we're not even allowed to ask them where they spent the money. And I've been trying to get the Federal Reserve audited. We're getting a little bit of auditing. We got a little information from last year after the big bailout. We found out 1/3 of those trillions of dollars they created went to foreign banks. So it's out of control, but it's not all their fault. It's our fault too, because we allowed it to happen. And that's why the American people are rising up now and saying, enough is enough. We can't do this much longer. And we also know that ultimately the system breaks down. And I think that's what we're witnessing now. We've seen the first big crack, and that was the financial bubble crack. There was the hint of it with the NASDAQ bubble crack, and then the housing bubble crack. And now there's a dollar bubble and a bond bubble. Everybody still in the world trusts America. We have the military power, and they'll take our money, and we're still living on borrowed money. And we can still buy stuff from around the world and live beyond our means. But now we're starting to see people living beneath their means. And the real tragedy about this is the immorality of the people who suffer are the ones least responsible for it. The people who benefited with the bubbles. You know, the bankers and the big corporations and the government, they're the ones who get the bailout. And who suffers? It's the middle class that suffers because they lose their jobs, and then they lose their houses, and they have all kinds of problems. But that is a characteristic of the acceptance that you can counterfeit money. The Bible is very clear about money. It talks about money in quite a few places, but its strong admonition is that we should have honest weights and measures. I mean, we know thou shalt not steal, and thou shalt not kill, but thou shalt not counterfeit money too. That is in the Bible, and yet we know if you and I counterfeit, we can get put in prison, and rightfully so. Matter of fact, that is only one of 4 laws at the national level that is supposed to be enforced by the federal government. In 1792, when they had the first Coinage Act, after we had our new Constitution, they wrote a law that said that if you counterfeit the money, you'll get the death penalty. That's how strongly they felt about it. And yet today, counterfeit is the way we're living. And most of the argument now in Washington is who's going to get the last pieces of the pie. And there's, unfortunately, not a very serious attempt to cut up there. The Republican side are starting to cut, they'll whittle away here, and the Democrats get hysterical. You can't cut anything. And we don't have enough votes to cut significantly, so we will face a crisis. And we have placed our trust and our faith in a false God, and that God is government. And we have to change that. We have to place our confidence and faith in our God who has given us the responsibility to care for ourselves and care for our family. But it gets tough when the government doesn't provide a general environment where you can do it, where they interfere with contracts, they interfere with the monetary value, they interfere with bankruptcy laws, and the government's always interfering. And then they load on the regulations, then they load on the taxation, and it gets pretty hard. You say, yeah, I want to take care of myself, but it's getting pretty hard to do it because of all the roadblocks put in the way. So I believe it all comes from a misunderstanding of where our rights come from, our own responsibility. Now, I believe in very, very limited government. Sometimes people object, you don't want hardly any government. I don't want very much government. And one of my arguments for this is that you know, when it comes to our religious faith, I think most of us agree that that is a very personal matter. Our salvation is not going to be delivered to us by our parents. It's not going to be delivered to us by a collective group. Just joining a church, you don't gain salvation. This is very personal. If that most important thing called salvation is purely personal, what about all the other things we do? What about personal choices elsewhere? If we can have free will and choices there, what about the free will and choice of what we read and what we eat and all the other habits that we have? See, I'm not for passing a lot of laws like that because I don't think they work. And I think it's much better for us to have the freedom that we desire and put the responsibility on us. And the main goal of political action for me and for many others is to preserve liberty. not to be the king and tell us how we're going to redistribute wealth and help this group versus this group. It's there to preserve liberty. And what is the purpose of life? To me, the purpose of life is an opportunity to strive for excellence and virtue. And if that is our goal, we want the government out of our way. We don't want the government telling us how we can achieve virtue or a perfect economic society, a perfect fair society. That interferes with property rights. It rejects the notion of personal responsibility, and it ends up badly. And that's where we are today, because we as a people, not you as an individual, but we as a people generally have given up that responsibility. We have not assumed that responsibility that we're in charge. And if you had a truly free society, I don't think for a minute you would have to worry about where your next meal is coming from. You say, oh yes, but there will be some that can't take care of themselves. But if you change a whole system for the few who have problems, you're going to make sure that there are a lot more people who are going to have problems. And that, I think, is what's happening today. So you say, well, still, you have to help people. Well, the most important thing that anybody can do, if you have a humanitarian instinct to help other people, is defend liberty, defend property, defend low taxes. And even those who refuse to give their money away to help the poor do no harm. Because for them to make money in a free society, they have to provide you a service or a good that you can vote for or you can reject. And in that way, they have to create jobs. But there are others, and I would say in the Christian community especially, there are others who believe you should go further than that, other than just saying, well, I'm a good investor and I create jobs, and I believe in that. But there are others who will say, well, we need to go an extra mile, and Christ obviously taught us this. And that is to help the downtrodden, help the sick. I practiced medicine when there was no government involved, and worked in a Catholic hospital for very, very little money. Nobody was ever turned away. Today, people have trouble getting medical care. The cost is so high. The charges are always the maximum. And yet we have the government designated that medical care is a right. Education is a right. I don't believe that. I believe you have a right to your life, you have a right to your liberty, and you have a responsibility to take due care of yourselves and be involved in your family life and have a system where the family is in charge of the education, the family is in charge, and then, because there would be an abundance, there would be enough wealth for us to share it. And besides, the number of people living in poverty would be so much less. And today, think of the people, quite frankly, our government doesn't give us the accurate statistics on the unemployment. It's very, very high. It's over 20%, and that's why people are very unhappy. No matter what the government says. Last week, unemployment dropped below 9%. No inflation. Inflation 2%. I don't know anybody who really believes that. They will, I wouldn't ever say they lie to us, but they sure do fib to us. And they deceive us. They deceive us, and they make us. But there's a lot of problems that exist that I am convinced that can be solved by doing what we haven't done. We have had too many people who have a careless attitude about the rule of law, what the Constitution says, what the federal government's allowed to do, what the state governments are allowed to do, and responsibility. And because of that, I think the solution isn't that complicated. Why don't we just all obey the Constitution? I think that would be a good place to start. So we have a lot of disagreements there because we have been taught too often in our schools. Our public school system has taught us for years that the Constitution is not to be overly rigid. It's to be flexible and pliable and adaptable to modern times. And therefore it's relative, has relative value. I say, well, yes, the founders took care of that. They knew it wouldn't be overly rigid because they allow you to amend it. Oh yeah, but that takes too long. So then they throw it out the window. And once you can throw it out the window for any one thing, the rest is up for grabs. And we started throwing individual things out the window a long time ago. And that is why it's so hard, to cut. Because I have people come to my office and they say, cut, 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 the deficit's out of control, but by the way, will you vote my fight? Don't come vote to cut my package. And it's going to be cut. It's not going to be cut because all of a sudden they're going to listen to this speech if I give it there or when I give it there. It's going to end because we won't be able to afford it. But the important thing for us as citizens, responsible citizens, we have to realize that we have a spiritual obligation and we have an obligation to obey the rule of law. We have an obligation to think about the future generations. Most everybody in this room, I'm quite sure that we've done pretty well and we've enjoyed it. But I think most people here are starting to realize there's nothing going to guarantee that our kids that are going to school right now or getting out of college and can't get a job, it's going to last forever. So therefore, we better know what to do. If you don't like the monetary system, and I don't, we better have a proposal on what to do about it. And we get guidance there from our Constitution, we get guidance there from our Bible, and counterfeiting and debasing the currency is immoral, illegal, and unconstitutional. So that's a pretty good start. But we need more faith, more confidence, and understanding what true liberty is all about. True liberty doesn't mean that you have certain rights to have economic freedom, but we better regulate people on their social behavior because I don't like what they're doing. But the whole thing is if you do that, your religious behavior will be social behavior and they'll want to regulate that, and they are starting to do that now. So that is why you want to protect liberty. When people do harm to others, when they steal and defraud and do harm or threaten harm, that is the role and responsibility of the government. But other than that, it's Christ taught tolerance as well, not to the way he talked to the prostitute and others. I mean, it was an understanding, and tolerance is very important. If there is no tolerance, I'm afraid we're going to be on the receiving end. We as Christians. So therefore, you want to protect your liberty and limit the enforcement to those who cause harm, who cause injury, who cause theft, and counterfeit. That's a role for government. But we should think seriously about our Constitution, not only on the monetary issues and welfare state, but also on our foreign policy. There's no authority that says that we should be the endless policemen of the world. We don't have the money, we can't do it, it costs too much. That was the argument with Samuel. He said, don't get a king, it's going to cost a lot. It's amazing how strongly they emphasize the cost. And just think of the cost to us. Since the last 10 years, in the 2 wars that are going on and spreading, and maybe we're going into Libya, well over $1 trillion, probably closer to $2 trillion. It's going to go on and on. And people are seriously saying, well, when are we going to send the troops to Libya? Well, do you have any more money to send over there and get in the middle of another civil war? And besides, we shouldn't go to war without a declaration. I think we wouldn't be fighting so many wars and we'd get on a lot sooner if you had a true need. You declared a war. Remember, World War II was just slightly over, what, 3.5 years? And that was accomplished because the enemy was known, the declaration was there, and everybody was behind it. And here we are. I mean, Vietnam lingered, Korea lingered, we're still in Korea, and here we're in Afghanistan. Haven't we read history, the recent history, the downfall of the Soviet system? I mean, we as a people have to wake up, or are we going to wait until we're totally bankrupt and the troops will come home because we won't be able to pay them? But the transition can be tough. That is what my struggle is for. Make sure, because I do anticipate that things will get tougher, and we as people will have to make a decision on what we want. What do we want the role of government to be? And to me, the role of government ought to be there to protect liberty, to protect individuals, to protect our families, put the responsibility at the local level, not on the king that has gone astray in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much.